Hello and welcome to my channel. My name's Nina and today I'm going to show you how to make this super cute detachable collar. We're going to go through the full process of making a collar today. So we're going to go from pattern making to actually constructing your collar, and I highly recommend this if you're new to pattern making or fairly new because it's a pretty simple project. Now I'm going to be working on my dress form today to construct my collar. So you'll need to either work on your dress form or on yourself or a friend because we're going to be drafting the collar actually on the form. I love this project because you get to do everything yourself, which means you can customize it however you want. So I've made these two Peter Pan collars, but you can make a collar that comes down past your shoulders. You can make one that's pointy at the end. You can make a really tiny one or a massively oversized one. It's totally up to you. So you'll need either your dress form or yourself to work on. You'll need some tape. Whatever tape it is totally fine, but we're going to be using it to construct the shape of the collar. And then you'll need some fabric to make a toile, so to make a mock-up of your collar first. And then you'll need your final fabric. I'm also using lace for mine to make a little frill on the end, but that's totally optional. And then you'll just need everything for sewing. So you'll need some pattern making paper, any paper will work, your ruler, pens, pencils, sewing machine, scissors, that kind of thing. So to start with, we're going to be working on our dress form, or yourself or a friend, but a dress form is definitely a lot easier to do this. And you're going to need some tape. I just cut strips out of masking tape because I don't actually have pattern making tape, but that's totally fine. You can use whatever you have at home, it'll work just fine. So we're only going to be making a pattern for half of the collar, so we'll just be using half of the form. So when you actually cut it out on fabric, you'll cut it out with fabric folded in half, and then you'll get a perfectly symmetrical pattern and a perfectly symmetrical collar. So as you can see on my form, I already have a center front line and a center back line stitched into the form. If you don't have this, I do suggest marking it out so that you make sure you get a nice, even and centered collar. Now, I don't want my collar sitting right up on the neckline, so I am going to tape in a new neckline that is just a little bit further down from that and then sits just under here as well, so your collar isn't sitting right up tight on your neck and it's not cutting into your neck on the side either. So just 1 or 2 centimeters down from the neckline will work totally fine for this. You just want it to be a smooth curve all around the neck. So you do that from the front all the way back to the center back line here. And now it's time to choose what kind of shape you want your collar to have. I have already made a Peter Pan collar before, so I've already got a pattern for that. So I think I'm going to make, I think it's called a long point collar. So I'm going to make it with a point that comes down here instead of a nice curve. So you can choose whatever you want to do here. The process is exactly the same. So I'm just starting from the center front line, that point where I started here, and I'm just choosing whatever shape that I want. I can always go back and retape this if I don't like it. It generally takes a couple of goes to get exactly what you want. Now for the shoulder seam, I'm going to come right over to the edge here where the shoulder seam would normally be on a shirt because that's how I like my collars to sit. I like it to sit nice and to the edge. You can always come in closer if you want a smaller collar, but if you want a kind of standard size that does come to where your shirts finish, I would suggest going right to the edge of your form. Okay, now I'm going to move on to the back. So once you've got a shape that you're happy with on the front, you can move to the back. So I do just want a nice smooth curve to come around the back here. For regular collars, they're all pretty similar. They have a kind of just curve that goes straight around the back. You can always do something different if you want. You could even replicate the front and make 2 points at the back, but I just want it to be nice and smooth and consistent across the entire line. So I'm going to take my tape, start from the shoulder seam again, and then just build in that shape however I want it. Okay, so once you're happy with the shape you've created, we're going to move on to our toiling fabric. So remember, this is just fabric for a mock-up, for a sample, for a test. Don't use fabric that you love or expensive fabric. This was just an old bed sheet that I got at the op shop, so I highly recommend getting a fabric from the op shop, things that are ugly and nobody wants to use, otherwise it is going to get wasted for this sample. I've also just gone over my lines in black pen to make them a bit more visible. So what we're going to do now is place the fabric over your pattern, and we want to make sure that it's sitting flat because we're creating a flat pattern. So we're going to make one pattern for the whole thing, for the front and the back, and then the back center seam will be the place that you fold on your pattern. Okay, so you just want to get it adjusted so that it's sitting across your entire pattern piece. And then I'm going to cut away the neckline so that I can actually make sure this sits flat. Okay, so it's going to take a bit of adjusting to make sure that you've got the fabric sitting around your neck instead of like pulling around it, because you won't be able to get your pattern out of this fabric if it's pulling like this. So it just takes a bit of adjusting to get it right, and I'm just going to have to cut away a bit more of the neckline here so that it can actually sit flat. So I'm just cutting away this section here. And just remember to use pins as well to keep everything in place so that it doesn't keep moving on you. Okay, so it takes a bit of time, but you need to make sure you get every piece that is covering your pattern to be flat. So I've got it all flat here, doesn't matter if it bunches up past that. And then I've also got it flat around the back here, and there's no bunching where my pattern is going to be, except here. So you just have to keep moving everything until it is perfectly flat, otherwise you'll end up with a pattern that kind of sticks up and doesn't create the right shape that you want to once you've actually cut it out in your final fabric. So once everything is perfectly flat and you've got all of your taped pieces covered, so where the pattern is going to be is completely covered by your fabric, you can go ahead and grab your chalk or any pen that you use to mark out your pattern. Just make sure it's not too heavy, otherwise it will bleed through onto your form, which wouldn't be very nice. So I'm just going to follow the line of the tape. If you're using a transparent fabric, it's always easier, but if you're using something that's a bit thicker, you can just use your finger to feel where the tape is underneath. So I'm just going to mark out the entire pattern piece like this. Now for this section here, there will be a bit of a curve to your line once you've laid out your fabric flat because of the bust, although when I cut that out into my paper pattern, I'm just going to straighten it off with a ruler because I don't actually want my collar curving around the bust, I just want it to sit flat across it. Once you have traced out your pattern, we're just going to take this fabric off the mannequin and then cut it out so that we have our first little mock-up of our pattern piece. So once I've cut it out in my fabric, I'm just going to bring it back to the form and make sure everything is how I wanted it to be. As you can see here, I cut in a little bit too far on this shoulder seam. So when I make my paper pattern, I'm just going to bring it out a little bit further so that it sits a bit further out. So you can just check and make sure everything is nice and how you planned for it to be. I also accidentally curved this a little bit too much, but again, I just fix that with my rulers when I make my paper pattern. Now, another important thing to do is to make sure that we have marked out our shoulder line here, which will be an important notch in the final pattern piece. Here I'm just tracing out my first draft pattern piece, so I'm just using the fabric pattern that I made and tracing it onto some butcher's paper, and this is what we'll use for our first draft. So now I'm just going to be using my straight ruler and my French curves to neaten up all of the lines that I have here. If you don't have a French curve, don't worry about it though. Just make sure that your straight lines are straight. This was also the point that I wanted to extend here. This is my shoulder seam here at the edge that I cut in a little bit too far, so I'm just going to extend that as well. Now I'm also just going to straighten up this point here because this curve was caused because of the bust, but when I have my final collar, I want it to sit nice and flat across the bust. So I'm just going to use my ruler to kind of straighten this out. And we'll see how that looks when I make my toile. For the curves, you just need to make sure they are smooth and consistent, and you can do this with French curves or without them. Don't forget to mark out important points on your pattern as well. So this here is the center front. This is the center back, and this is the shoulder seam. Now once that's all done, I'm going to cut out this paper pattern, not worrying about seam allowance, as you will add seam allowance to your final pattern, but this pattern now is just the draft. Now this is just a draft pattern, so I'm going to label it draft collar so that I don't get it mixed up with my other pattern pieces. And now it's time to cut out a toile or a mock-up of our pattern. So you're going to place the center back line on the folded edge of your fabric, and don't forget this is just a toile, so use your toiling fabric. And I always like to trace mine out before I cut it because it just makes the process a little bit easier. And don't forget to snip your notches that you made at the shoulder line. So now that we have our toile cut out, we can put it on the form and see if everything sits exactly how we like it to. Okay, so I'm really happy with this. I think it's super cute. It sits really nicely. Everything worked out well. One thing I am going to do is just add an extra centimeter to this entire seam line here because I still want it to sit just a little bit further across the shoulders. But that's something that I can do when I trace out my final pattern piece because it's very simple. I'm just adding a centimeter to this entire line, which will go all the way across the back here to make it just that little bit bigger. So once you're happy with everything, we can take it off the mannequin and we can use our draft pattern piece to trace out our final pattern piece. So I'm just starting out by tracing my pattern lightly in pencil before I go over it in pen. And then I'm using my pencil as well to create a 0.6 centimeter seam allowance. You can also do 1 centimeter if you like. And then I'm just going over this line gently in pencil again before I trace everything in pen, as you can see here. I did make a little mistake here though. You don't need to add any seam allowance to your center back line as I have done here, but I cut that off later so I don't actually use it like that. And don't forget to label your pattern piece as well. Okay, so now that we have our pattern piece ready to go, it's time to choose our main fabric and our lining fabric. I'm going to be using this beautiful vintage fabric that I found at the op shop that I'm absolutely in love with. This will be for the outer, and then I'm going to use just a plain white fabric for the lining, just so that I can use less of this like really pretty fabric because I love it so much. And then I'm also going to be using this gorgeous ruffled lace for the edge of my collar, just like this one, which I also found at the op shop. I highly recommend buying secondhand fabrics because it's way better than buying new fabrics because it's much more sustainable and you're consuming less new products. And also keep in mind that you can make a reversible collar. So on this one, it actually has like a floral print on the other side, so I can wear it both ways. So if you want to make your lining fabric just a different fabric so that you can wear your collar in 2 different styles, then you can also do that as well. So now it's time to cut out our fabric. You'll need to cut 1 collar from the lining and 1 collar from your main fabric. I always start with the lining just in case I make a mistake. I'm just tracing here and then cutting it out because it makes the process a little bit easier. And also don't forget to cut out your notches as well. Now to measure how long we want our lace to be, we're going to measure from here all the way around to here. And you're also going to need 2 bits of ribbon that I recommend being about 35 to 40 centimeters long, and they will be what you use for your ties at the front of the collar. I'm starting with my lining fabric and I'm placing the lace along the edge about 2 centimeters back from the center front line, and then the ribbon about 1 centimeter back from the center front line, as you'll need that 0.6 to 1 centimeter for your seam allowance. Now I'm just pinning the ribbon in place and then going around and pinning the lace all around the edges. When you get to the corner, if you're doing a pointed collar, it is a bit more difficult. I had to kind of pinch it at the end and then fold the lace back up and then pin everything, trying not to tuck the lace onto the other side. It just takes a bit of work, but you'll be able to get it in the end. In hindsight, a pointed collar is a bit harder to make than a Peter Pan collar, so if you're a beginner or new to this, then I would suggest making a Peter Pan collar with a smooth curve. Now your collar should be looking something along the lines of this, with your lace or your trim all added to the edges. And now we're going to add the main fabric on top and pin everything together. So we're working on the right side of this fabric, and then we're going to put right sides together of our main fabric as well. So right side to right side, and I'm just going to pin everything all together now. Once it's all pinned, we can move on to the fun part, which is actually sewing this all together. So I'm going to sew from here all the way around the entire thing and back to this point. We need to leave a point open here so that we can flip it inside out when we finish sewing. Make sure you also sew things very slowly and carefully. You don't want to catch your ribbon, which should be sitting on the inside now, in any of your seam lines here, and you want to make sure that your lace or your trim is sitting nice and flat on the inside. So now it's time to turn it the right way around, which we can do from this opening here, and hopefully everything will be as it's meant to be. So everything looks really nice. The only thing is that in these corner bits I did accidentally sew the lace down onto this side as well, so it doesn't stick out quite so nicely here, and I did it on this side as well here, so it kind of got tucked in because those corners were hard to sew, but it doesn't bother me too much because it's not super noticeable and it still looks super cute. So I'm going to leave it as it is, and now all that I need to do is press all of my seams and then also fold and press these bits under, and then I'll be top stitching around the entire thing to make sure it all sits nice and flat. Okay, now that everything is looking pressed and beautiful, I'm going to top stitch around the entire thing and just making sure to close off this opening that was at the front. And there you have it, a finished collar. I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. I really loved making it and I really hope it was helpful. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below and I'll get back to you. And if you do make a collar or you use the techniques that I showed you in this video, message me or share them with me or tag me. I absolutely love seeing what you guys make. It makes me so happy to know that you're enjoying these videos and using these tutorials. So hit me up, please. Don't forget to like and subscribe. You can also find me on Instagram and TikTok. Thank you guys so much for watching my video.